I guess we'll see what kind of metamorphosis this is. So, yes, I said that. It's bullshit, and the world swims in it. Now, a lot of times we get this idea that somehow it's always a modern thing. It's not. People have always been doing it, and you're like, well, what is it? And I have found as I've been talking to people about it, it really actually first comes to me, I should make a confession. There's a Princeton philosopher named Harry Frankfurt, and he actually wrote a really short, and it's really short, if you want to borrow it, you can, essay called On Bullshit. And the term has started to come up more and more since he's done that. He actually has a very good YouTube channel about it. But when I first read that, it suddenly came to me, and I said, well, wait, what is that? Where does that exist in when we think about it? Because then you're saying, well, then isn't bullshit just lying? But no, it's not. We would assume if there's lying, there must be truth. So, and I'll try to get at this a little bit, because truth is a hard one. And I would argue with the way we live, it's hard to put your finger on the idea of truth. People usually back off that word because it's so difficult. It's very demanding, actually. Lying is the rejection of the truth. It's actually recognizing that something might be true. In other words, I will show up on time. And saying you will with no intention of doing it, you've lied. That's not bullshit. That's not BS. And so the idea then is somewhere in between there. Do you like this? Yeah, I really like it. Maybe you like it a little bit. We don't like it that much. And we do that, I'm being simplistic. We do that a lot, I think. And we see that a lot. And it becomes to the point that the other two, lying and telling the truth, move so far away, and the space between them becomes so stacked with BS that I think we lose track of those two things. The one of which, and when I come to the end, I'll have a kind of a thought about it. But lying, in a way, lying's more direct. Lying's almost more truthful than bullshit, because you're in rejection of something. So, why is this a problem? I'm going to give you what I think are a series of examples. I kind of start easy, and I'll kind of work my way through. Things to think about. I don't think, I think the ideas with the TED Talk, things have to be profound, which may be BS, because being a human and being profound seems almost impossible. I would just like for there to be a little bit provocative, and then maybe you would think about it, or encourage you, or better yet, you get mad about what I just said and say, hey, he's full of BS, and then think about why I am. And go from there. So let me give you an easy one. The BS greeting. So I'll give you a personal example from several weeks ago. I was mad about something. I know none of you can picture me as being upset, but the idea is that mad about something, and I was really kind of, I'll use my own word, demoralized. And somebody who's, let's say, an administrator here, was walking past me, and I had a number of students standing around me, and I was feeling kind of cheeky about it. And they said, hey, Lee, how are you doing? And I said, I'm bad. I'm really demoralized. And they went, oh. And they walked away. And I realized at that moment, I don't think they don't care about me, because I think we think there's only one thing or the other. I'm sure they wouldn't want anything bad to happen to me. Well, I'd like to think that. I'm sure they wouldn't want anything bad to happen to me, but at the same time, if you told somebody that, right, when you say that in a greeting, hey, how are you doing? Isn't there almost the expectation that somebody would care? But their expectation was, because they're BSing you, they don't care that much. But when you actually say, I really feel bad, they're like, oh no. That undermines that concept. And it gets at that idea. And then so there's this long chasm between the idea of the truth, I do care. You know what? What's wrong? Tell me about it. And you do, and it's true because you know, you have people who do that, right? You all encounter people, at least I hope you do, that if you said, I'm really sad, they'd be, oh my gosh, and stop and say, tell me, what's wrong? And then I guess there'd be other people who, I guess if you really didn't care, if you wanted to be honest about it, you would just walk by. And we would do it that way. Two, the own picky one of mine, the idea of the BS of trying to delineate between what we call free speech or free expression and what often gets labeled as generically, which I think is a mistake, as hate speech or hurtful speech. That's really problematic. And I think it's really problematic in the last few years because it seems to me there is hate speech. There are really violent things that can be said. But there's a tremendous amount of free expression. And at what point is what you say labeled as something difficult because somebody doesn't want to have to deal with you? And so it's not that they think it's hateful or harmful, it's just difficult. Or worse, it undermines what they're trying to say or get across. And worse again, they don't want to have to try to engage you. I actually think the BS portion of this is them saying, it's just too complicated, or I'm not confident in what I'm telling you, that I can actually tell you what it means, or why you should agree with me. And if that's the case, then you're filling up in that space, in which case the people who are telling you their idea, because they don't let you express yourself back to them, you stop believing them. Or you think they're just up to something. And so if you're telling me I can't talk, it must be because you don't know what to say to me. And not because you don't have good ideas, because you may have a better point. But now I can't have it. And so we're stuck in that chasm in between again. The BS of what I call current ethics, maybe ethics in general. I taught a seminar here for a decade on ethics. Nobody knows what that word means. If you Google ethics, it says system of morals. And then if you Google morals, it says a system of ethics. People love to use that word. There are ethics. There's normative ethics, and there's lots of people, Kantian and Rawlsian. There's all these wonderful ethical systems. It's problematic because we always use it in the plural, so we don't think there's a definitive one. And I guess there's not. But if somebody's always saying to you, right, you're acting unethically, ask them next time, based on what? Well, that's wrong. Well, then that means it's illegal. Or do you mean it's unethical? And then we're stuck again. They don't know. So people use that word sometimes, I fear, when the importance of ethical behavior, which is really difficult to define, because it's not illegal behavior is illegal. Unethical is a different thing. It leaves us without the ability to know or think about right behavior, not illegal, but right behavior. Or we start to see the people using it on us behave ethically as a means of control. And we become rejectionist to the idea that we should embrace something or try to with this. Fourth, and the idea of future work or work in the future, and I was reading something last year. We're often told, you all are told, especially since we're talking about youth, the idea that you would become good future workers, that I would train you for the future. The BS part of that is, I don't know what the future looks like. And the idea that I have a specific thing that you have to learn, and specific things you have to do, and specific tools you have to have. The guy's point is the idea that because of AI and a whole bunch of other things that are coming up, it may turn out there isn't work in the future. Or the way we think about work may be 5 hours a week. And perhaps what we really want to say when we should say education, because this is harder, I think BS is often tied to laziness, is that we would like for you to become the best educated person you could be. And learn, you hear it occasionally sometimes, I think people are being thoughtful, to think critically, although that's a hard one too, to be well-read, to be thoughtful, to be able to speak effectively, to be able to write effectively. Because you can learn the other stuff. You can pick up writing a computer language or something like that. But we don't know what the future is. And when people say, you have to work like the future, they think the future is now. Because you're learning what is now, not what's the future. And so it becomes, I think, kind of demoralizing. Fifth one, the BS of a best life. You hear that, all right? Live your best life. What's that? And so that becomes, and the thing underneath it is pronounced ikigai. It's a Japanese philosophy from several hundred years ago. It's really quite appealing, and it talks about, and I would challenge you to do this maybe later on if you're bored. Google the word, or Google Japanese life philosophy, and this will come up immediately. And what happens is that we hear about these things, right? You hear all these terms, life coach. I saw one the other day, thought coach, thought partner, best life, that kind of stuff. And it was the idea in this Japanese philosophy that the reason the Japanese live, and it literally said this, first thing that comes up when you Google it, you live your best life, and that's why the Japanese are so much happier than we are and live so much more fulfilled lives. And so I quick Googled and I said, I wonder what the suicide rate difference is between Japan and the United States. It turns out it's twice as high for males and 3 times as high for females. which means they're not wrong. I don't think all Japanese are unhappy. And I think the philosophy, actually, if you read the older stuff, is actually quite interesting. But they're BSing you about what it means because they want you to kind of buy something. There was a bunch of advertisements for life coaches and things and like that kind of stuff. And so it also creates the idea there must be a best life. Can't there just be life and you live the life you're living is good? Because best is a real demand. That means you have to live up to something all the time. Maybe sometimes I don't want to live up to it. Maybe I just want to be in it. And maybe we could embrace that concept of being. There's a favorite comedian of mine named Tom Papa, who performs in Chicago a lot. And he often talks about, the fact that you got up, got to work, went to school, worked on some stuff, did some things, talked to some friends. That's a great, that's good. But is that like best? Did you do something exotic? Did you change the world? I think that creates feelings of inadequacy because there's that BS that we have to be this kind of super person, which generally isn't attainable. That doesn't mean you can't be good, but best is a lot. BS of data. So now data is useful in the sense that you have scientific data, right? You do when you do tests on things, and whether it's in medicine or in a number of things, and you have provable stuff. But when you get into opinion data, and the data often gets used now with the idea of opinion, it gets really problematic. And I think it also comes to start to undermine the idea of real data. A good example might even be the idea several years ago when they were calling people to ask who they were going to vote for. And they kept voting, they kept calling, and they're like, no, we have data that shows that clearly Trump's going to lose the presidency. Well, it turns out that's people's opinions. That's how I felt Friday afternoon when I answered the phone. It turns out a lot of people didn't answer the phone, and it was wrong. And they were perplexed at the idea. And so at the best, data can maybe that kind of data can inform, but I think there's a real BS attached to the idea that we have to be driven by the non-scientific data to the point where we become almost dependent on it, to the point where we can't think for ourselves and try to make best decisions or good decisions. The BS of congratulations. A lot of people when something, and I can remember, I can think for years while I was in graduate school, I can remember being a culprit in this. People get something or do something, and you're like, hey, great for you. And you don't mean it, right? And you'll say that, and people can tell. There's a particular one at IMSA I'll talk about in a minute. But the fact is that people really don't mean that. Maybe they do, because there are people who do, and you have friends, and you can, I bet you could tell the difference right away between people who look really excited for you, and then there's that weird, uncomfortable kind of like, hey, great. It undermines the idea of interacting with people. Now, I'm not sure what you're supposed to do when you're stuck in this situation, not to say it, but it's problematic. The one that always gets me, and I've heard about over the last several years, particularly, and I'll give an IMSA example, is the idea that when people get in, because there's the notion of certain colleges that are good to get into, and then there's certain colleges that are okay to get into. And if you get into, and there are people who really put a lot of meaning into it. I think it's a kind of an insecurity thing, but put a lot of meaning into getting into the kind of what I call the kind of top tier stuff. And the people who don't, and I've actually heard people turn around and say, oh, you got in there, congratulations, I'm sure you'll get in somewhere better. And I think there's that kind of the BS of that blows away the idea that I feel good that I got in here, but now I don't. You literally gave and took at the same moment, but you took more than you gave. And so it creates a real falseness with that. When we see that, right? False people usually aren't dishonest. People we think aren't really, well, let's use the word fake. That we think are fake are really more BS than they are dishonest, aren't they? What I think is the BS of unity. I don't think it's necessary to be unified and stuff. I think we can have different thoughts. I think we want to be in different places. I think we can find different things that we like, and you can like something and I don't. Why can't I like the idea that you don't like what I like, if that makes sense? I think it would be better if you liked something that I didn't, because then I would have to hear about something different. And you hear about it a lot with, I think in the United States in the last few years, you hear about a lot of things, the idea that people tend to live with people who are like them or have the same opinions they do and stuff like that. And then we hear that's bad. But then at the same time, we hear about the idea, right, from a lot of politicians, but other people in general, we have to have unity. We have to end up in the same place. We have to have the same thinking on something. But why? Why does that have to be the case? Doesn't mean unity. And then there's what I consider to be the BS part of this as well, the idea that if we're not unified, we're somehow at each other. Seems to me diversity is the stuff in between unity and disliking what each other thinks. But you can like something and I don't. We don't have to be unified in our thought. I think that's what leads to the whole cancel culture concept, is the idea that, no, you have to like what I like. Well, I don't. Well, you have to think the way I do. Well, I like some of it, but I don't like all of it. No, all of it. And so that word, I actually think that word becomes somewhat oppressive. Number 9, pickier. I don't know if this will go well. Then the idea of servant leader or leader as giving. I think anybody who chooses to lead, unless they're just, somebody like, say, a Putin or something like that. But anybody, and I've watched students lead clubs for decades and do all that kind of stuff. The idea of servant leadership means, am I doing it because I want to do it, because I enjoy doing it, or do I feel like I have to do it? And if I feel like I have to do it, am I really getting something out of it, or am I just a servant? And I know it comes out of a kind of a sort of a Christian context, but I think it's, why can't you just be a leader? And if I said leader, if I put the word good in front of it, or effective, it would have the same meaning. But to do this is to somehow demean the idea that you put a lot of extra work into being a leader. And I can tell you from watching, especially from watching people who work with clubs and stuff like that, and lead clubs, there's a lot of work. And the idea that they're serving isn't really right. The idea that they're working hard is. And I think it demeans the process of it. BS of being comfortable. The other reality, and this is also I picked up from a couple other people, I think to be human is to be uncomfortable. I think it's inherently uncomfortable being human, especially if you have any level of reflection on who and what you are. And if you're thinking about who you are and what you say and what you think on occasion, you should occasionally go home or sit down in your dorm room or something and go, ooh, I'm not comfortable with what I said, who I am, where I'm going, what I did. Uncomfortable doesn't mean you failed. Now, uncomfortable doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you would be like, but I think this is idea we're supposed to be, right, best life, most comfortable. Everything in existence is supposed to be like wearing your pajamas and laying on the couch and watching TV, which seems to become a primary pastime. But the idea that things aren't always like that, and sometimes, and talking to people, the whole, with the unity thing, that notion of being and engaging is uncomfortable. Having conversations with people can inherently be uncomfortable. That's good. You should be, right? You should feel agitated occasionally. If you're not stretching yourself. But that means being uncomfortable. So now, the BS of finding your passion. I think that people can come to have a passion for something. But the idea that it's just, and this is another one of those, I know a bunch of you are on LinkedIn, which is in and of itself perhaps one giant kind of BS system. But the idea is that you all go and they have those things, and there's a company, but in fact, my favorite one is a group called Inc., INC, period, and they put out all these little articles, and there's always these little 300 or 500 page little blurbs, 3 life hacks for this, or things to do with that, or how to figure out who you really are, or what you want to be, or where you want to go. And in 300 words, you would have figured your life out. Now, is there a place for you to go to? Probably. Is there something you might really be passionate about at some point? Maybe. But maybe the thing you do for a living isn't the thing you're really passionate about. Maybe you're really passionate about, your boat and fishing, and you do that on weekends. You all will, of course, probably go on to be, doctors and neuro people and engineers of different formats. And so you'll have this idea of a profession. But passions can be other things. Your passion may eventually become your, if you have children in some way or some. Your passion could be a spouse. But the idea that you have to find it I think, is unrealistic. It creates that tension between what can really be. Rather, you would think to say you would build your passion, that you would, as you encounter things, it might come to you. And at some point, maybe not, in the sense, because you say the word passion, it sounds like you're on fire. And maybe you won't be. Maybe it'll be a whole bunch of little things that you like to do. Because if you don't find it, is something wrong with you? I would say it's not, but that level of BS with this, because it's a big sales pitch, and I think it can become problematic. And then my own pet peeve, which isn't very important, but people over-modify all the time. That was an amazing talk. Nah, it was good, but it wasn't amazing. So that was a horrifyingly bad meal. What's left? What happens when there's a meteor coming? Is the meteor horrifying like the meal? In other words, don't. That was great. That was good. Good, right? Because otherwise, what's left after that? I get picky about this because I like the idea that something could just be good. And that's most of what life is, as opposed to, that was awesome. That was amazing. That was spectacular. Those words should be reserved for like big things. Like, right? Because otherwise, I think what we do with that is we build up the idea that everything has to be amazing. And most of the best things in life, not to burst any bubbles, are not amazing. They're good. And they can give you a great feeling and a great memory, but they're not something you have to jump up and down about. Okay. So does BS have a place? Yes. Comedy. I think it belongs in comedy. I think we have lots of we live in a world that's like comedy saturated, don't we? I mean, it's on all the time. It's in everything. I don't know, when you're not watching little kitten videos, you're probably watching comedy on YouTube or whatever it is you're watching. And because you can exaggerate. Matter of fact, comedy almost requires you to exaggerate and to kind of have a certain amount of BS blowing through things for it to be funny, doesn't it? You kind of overstate things. Usually there's truth in comedy too, which is why it's probably funny. Which is odd because we use BS in all the other stuff, but for some reason now, in the last several years, when you get to comedy, then people get offended at the idea of using BS in comedy, in other words, kind of exaggerating things. So we become more BS-oriented at the same time we become less tolerant of it as a comedy thing, which I think is not a particularly happy idea. Okay, now what? So what you're like, well, everything's BS then. What's left for me? So I guess I would have something like maybe like a challenge, which would be the idea that what do I think is true, and what do I think you could maybe aim at to try to travel up out of the BS? You'll never get out of it completely. I'll never get out of it completely. We'll always end up in at some point. You'll have that panic moment when somebody asks you something, and you'll BS them, because you will. So the goal then is to be less so, not more so. The other goal is that you would perhaps maybe start thinking about it. That's not that we wouldn't just immediately say somebody's lying, because that just kind of that means they think they know the truth, or that we do. But does that really sound honest? Does that really sound like it's correct, or does that sound inflated? Matter of fact, one of the words on the kind of lead-in is the word skepticism, and I think one of the great antidotes for BS is to be skeptical. When somebody, ideally maybe some of you do, when somebody really gets started and you get that feel for it, if you're actually listening to somebody, you get the feel for it and you're like, really? Yeah, I know you've all done it. Matter of fact, you try to counter it, right? I had somebody today say to me, to be honest, and you're like, are you lying? Or are you BSing me before that? We feel like we have to clarify, don't we? We almost feel like we have to kind of push back on the idea that we're sunk in it. I think the ultimate thing is that you would search for beauty. Because the only place we ever encounter truth is in what's beautiful. Now, what do I mean? Because beauty, then you immediately think of like a statue or a painting. I actually think that those can be beautiful. But beautiful more the idea when you have that moment, when you're looking at something or try to engage somebody or trying to be the absolute most genuinely honest you could possibly be, which is really hard and can be frightening. And I can tell you I have at least one experience with it, that the moment you experience that, And better yet, the moment you experienced it from somebody else, that moment of real honesty, where you really believe you're not being BS, is that beautiful moment. That's where you experience love. I mean love, like love somebody. I don't mean all those other things. Because we often, I think, confuse love with other things. But when we experience that, it's at that moment. And that's the moment you've traveled out of all that kind of BS or inflation that you have in whoever it is you're interacting with. So, skeptical, engage people with this. Don't just assume what you're hearing is true. I don't think most of you do anymore. But the idea to think about is to see these things. Really? Really? Is that really it? But the truth, the ability to step up out of the BS is that moment where you actually start looking for something, a beautiful argument, a beautiful mind, a beautiful interaction, and that feeling. You'll know it. Okay. Thank you.